everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus, coming at you with a different kind of video. We're going to see how this does. This is a deck guide for different decks in Modern, starting out with a deck that we are most familiar with on the channel, that being Boros Burn. As a friendly reminder, if you do like Modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. That said, this format's going to be a little bit different. Instead of gameplay, we're going to be talking about card choices, different setups for decks, etc., why certain things happen the way they are, and maybe get into a little bit of matchup breakdown about how to attack decks and stuff. So a little bit more informational than your typical deck tech, but maybe not as in-depth as, say, an article or something, but this is kind of meant to be as close to evergreen content as we can, and I do apologize for my glasses as they are going to be lopsided because I'm missing an earpiece. So that said, let's get in the video and see what happens. So the first part talking about burn is the creatures. A lot of people start with burn spells, burn does this, burn does that. The main thing with burn is you have to understand that the deck starts and ends with the creatures. The primary creatures you will see burn playing are Goblin Guide, Monster, Swift Spear, and Eidolon of the Great Revel. Occasionally you'll see other things like the Ronin, or some of the other ones you might see, Vexing Devil and such. Not going to really cover those, other than to say Legendary Ronin is a cute card, but constantly have to paying 1 mana over and over a turn, even though it does enable you to have the channel ability to discard it, draw a fresh card later. While it's nice, not particularly good card. Vexing Devil, Punisher mechanic, generally those aren't playable in a format like Modern. It is an okay budget option if you're looking for a different creature to play. It's okay in like the versions that were running Chandra's Inferno or Chandra's Incinerator as another card that has also seen play historically. These are all cards that have seen fringe play and generally speaking have been dismissed. Another card that used to see play in Burn was Wild Nacatl, back when Burn was more of a typical 3-color Naya version, but this was before the printing of Monster, Swift Spear and such, and has kind of been phased out as it's just not good enough on rate. The big thing with Burn's current creatures is they all have haste, or they all have some type of defensive ability that costs your opponent life generally to deal with them. Goblin Guide obviously being the primary one here, with it's a 2/2 whenever it attacks, reveal the top card of your opponent's library. If it's a land, they put it in their hand. This is a disadvantage for us as the Burn player, but it also can be an advantage in terms of giving information about what your opponent's draw might be. Allow you to play around certain cards in certain situations if you happen to see something off the top of your deck. One of the more recent well, not really recent additions, but one of the more recent creatures to the deck is Monster Swift Spear. Obviously, this is a hasty prowess creature. Works quite nicely in a deck you're playing a bunch of spells. And then the final one we see a lot of play is Eidolon of the Great Revel. This is a card that's waned and waxed over time as far as its positioning in the deck. Generally, it's been considered a main deck card. There have been times in the format when you're dealing with a bunch of Ether Vial decks, back when Humans and Spirits and some of the original Death and Taxes decks were kind of around in the format. This card it was debated whether it should stay in the main deck, mainly because it's a really terrible card against Ether Vial creature decks, but as those decks have kind of faded away as the current format has taken shape with, all of the elementals and everything else, and tribal decks are generally not considered particularly playable, this card has kind of risen back in stock. That said, there are a lot more answers to it than there used to be. The don't deal damage prismatic ending for 4, solitude pitch, etc. There's a lot of things that deal with this without taking damage, but still generally overall pretty solid card, and obviously the newest one being Boseiju. Another thing to look at in the deck is your composition of spells. The cards that I would say you'll see in almost every list that is of the Boros variety are these particular 12: 4 Lava Spike, 4 Lightning Bolt, 4 Boros Charms. Generally, if you're playing the Boros, which is the traditional version of Burn right now, you're playing Boros Charm. It's just 4 damage for 2 mana. It's probably the most efficient damage spell in the Modern format in terms of one card as far as damage capable for players. Lightning Bolt, the all-time staple for any type of Burn deck. It can target anything and it's instant speed. Lava Spike can target creatures or can target planeswalkers or players. And it's sorcery speed. Not the most impressive card, but it does match the rate of Lightning Bolt even if it is a sorcery speed card. Everything else that we'll talk about are cards that you'll see generally in most burn decks, but in different numbers. Riftbolt, this is a card from Time Spiral that allows you to basically, it's basically a suspend lightning bolt. The downside is if you don't have the time to suspend it, it does cost you 3 mana. Skewer the Critics is very much similar. It's also a sorcerer speed lightning bolt that with a spectacle cost, you can pay 1 to deal 3 damage. So generally on rate, you're going to be able to cast this for 1 mana, but there are some spots where there is 3. These cards are situationally worse than some of the other choices, simply because most of the time you can pay them for 1 mana, but there are times where you're going to have to pay for 3 mana for them. You know, whether you're facing down a Teferi Time Raveler, or whether you're coming in with your hand empty and your opponent's answered your board, and say you have 2 lanes in play. There are some odd spots where these cards are not necessarily the best, but generally you will see them in some number in most Boros Burn lists. Other cards that are a little bit more situational, Skullcrack is 2 damage for, or 2 mana for 3 damage. This does have a couple of special things. Prevents life gain for both players, and also prevents damage, which means, things like protection abilities and stuff. If your opponent blocks one of your creatures, suddenly protection from red goes out the window. So there are some spots where this is, but it's mainly played for the anti-life gain effects. Then the other cards you'll see playing are Searing Blaze and Lightning Helix. Searing Blaze, this card wanes and waxes as the number of creature decks or creatures you expect to face are higher or lower. Normally deals 1 damage to a creature, 1 damage to a player. You have to be able to target both. So if something like a Leyline of Sanctity is in play, then this card's completely useless. Although you can target your own creature and stuff for prowess, that's a whole other story. But if you happen to have landfall, which is where fetch lands become especially important in this deck, you do have the ability to do 3 damage to a creature, 3 damage to a player. This becomes one of your best tools against creature decks. Lightning Helix, primarily there for racing situations, for burn mirrors, for other aggressive decks. That's why this is one of those cards that you'll see wane and wax along with the rise and fall of Skullcrack. Oftentimes comes down to, do you expect there to be more life gain in the format, or do you expect there to be more racing situations where it's important to be able to recoup some life as you're taking damage from your mana base and from your opponent? Another consideration, a lot of people have started to cut Lightning Helix because of Ragavan, your opponent's Ragavan hitting and a Lightning Helix off top of your deck. I don't know if that's the best thing in the world. Your opponent's going to get a lot of value off of it. Yes, it does screw up the racing math a little bit, but I think that's a little bit of a corner case scenario that's not really a reason to consider leaving a card in the deck or not. Your opponent's going to draw a Boros Burn, or your opponent's going to draw a Monastery Swiftspear or a Goblin Guide or something off the Ragavan. Yeah, it doesn't gain them life, but still can change the race in their favor. So I think that's kind of a hollow argument. As far as the rest of the deck, the main thing you'll take a look at is the mana base. So the mana base can come down into a couple different categories. Whether you want to play 19 or 20 lands, you tend to play 20 if you want to make sure you hit your land drops. This was especially important when you had Luris and such in the deck. A little less important now, as generally you can operate on 2 or 3 mana. And then the other thing is, how many Canopy lands do you choose to run in your deck? The standard amount is usually the 4 copies of Sunbay Canyon. Fiery Islet tends to get played when there's no splash or no other utility lands. Like some people will begin to play the Red Crucible land. But Fiery Islet is kind of like your extra flood insurance. The downside of it is you're taking quite a bit of damage from your mana base when you're playing it, and it's only obviously good for the white mana, or not the white mana, the red mana. There were some corner case scenarios when Prismatic Ending was seeing some play in the burn sideboard of this being able to get you the 3rd copy of Prismatic Ending. But, not particularly relevant. Most of it comes down to, do you want a little bit more consistent, less painful mana, or do you want a little bit more flood insurance? The rest of the deck, generally you see 4 copies of Inspiring Vantage, as it's generally your best land to play on turn number 1. Gives you both your colors, no damage. Then 2 to 3 Sacred Founders are generally how many you see, along with 5 to 6 fetch lands, which once again that's important for being able to play Searing Blaze during your opponent's turn. And then 2 to 3 copies of Basic Mountain, depending on if you're running 19 lands, how many canopies lands you're running, etc. Mana base, not too fancy with burn, but you do have a little bit of utility with Sunbay Canyon and such, which can be quite important as this deck is prone to flood out over the course of a tournament or something. It gives you a little bit of extra oomph against certain decks. As far as the sideboard, Burn's sideboard has kind of varied over time. Currently, a lot of the cards you'll see are Path to Exile and Deflecting Palm, primarily against creature decks. Deflecting Palm pretty good against a number of threats, whether it be Primeval Titans, Valakites, Murktide Regents, Death Shadows, anything that's going to deal you a healthy chunk of damage. Now, Valakit's a little bit tricky because it only prevents the first trigger of Valakit per turn. Murktide, obviously, they have counter spells, etc., etc. But it is a nice card, especially when people aren't thinking about it. It can oftentimes swing you a game, dealing you 6 to 8 damage out of nowhere. Probably the most efficient as far as damage dealing spell, but it is predicated on your opponent dealing you damage, so it's one of the more conditional damage spells you'll have access to. Path to Exile, a lot of decks have gone away from Path to Exile, but Burn just simply can't get away from it because of the efficiency and the sorcery speed. Other cards you will see in the current Burn sideboards, Roiling Vortex has kind of taken the place of Skullcrack as your situational life gain prevention. This deals 1 damage to each player during their upkeep, and then it has the line of text of if a player plays a free spell, they take 5 damage, so got to be mindful of your own Rift Bolts, but your opponents have to be mindful of Pitch Elementals, they have to be mindful of Mistress Baubles, etc. And then you can pay 1, your opponents can't gain life. This does have a nice effect of you can still gain life, so your Lightning Helix is still trigger life gain. Smash to Smithereens is a card that you'll see most Burn decks going to when they're dealing with artifacts. This is primarily here for 2 reasons. The first one is Chalice of the Void can be a royal pain in the butt for Burn decks to beat, especially if you were like against the old Eldrazi Tron decks that would play multiple Chalices. They would be able to play like Chalice on 1, Chalice on 2. This kind of gives you a way out to blow up, an early Chalice from an opponent. The other main reason you'll see it is Hammer Time is still a big portion of the format. That's a deck with a ton of equipment and a ton of artifacts. This kind of gives you a nice out against that deck, in addition to Deflecting Palm being a good tool against a hammered up Colossus. And the final card you'll see in this particular sideboard is Sanctifying Veck. This is actually a card that a lot of Burn decks are moving away from, as since the banning of Lurrus, the number of Darcy and Ragavan decks have kind of dropped down a little bit, especially with no Death Shadow variants and stuff, not too much of that running around. Most of the Darcy Ragavan decks are now Murktide, which this card's okay against, but it's not like a game-breaking thing. And its graveyard benefit is nice, but really only worked against Reanimator. It's not very good against Blue Living End, which is the primary graveyard deck you'll play against right now. Still decent against Dredge, but it's not the best in the mirror. It's not the best against the graveyard decks you're expecting to face at this point in the meta. So a lot of people have gone back to more traditional graveyard hate in that regard. Other cards you will see as sideboard options that you will not see in the deck examples that I pulled out is Wear Tear. Wear Tear is a split card that allows you to hit an artifact or an enchantment, or fuse it to hit both. Usually you do that. You bring that into the sideboard rotation when you're expecting more copies of Leyline of Sanctity, which is a card that's kind of picked up in pace a little bit, as a lot of the Living End and Cascade decks bring it in simply because it keeps things from Endurance from hitting, keeps discard from hitting them, etc. It's just a low cost thing for their decks. And another card I believe is not in any of these lists is Exquisite Firecraft, which is a card that as long as you control or have more than 2 spells in your graveyard that are non-creature spells, so instants or sorceries basically for us, the spell is uncounterable. Especially as blue decks have gone away from Ether Gust, with Primeval Titan not being a huge thing in the format, and many other things. It is an uncounterable 4 damage, which a lot of times a blue mage can rely on something like a Force of Negation to keep them alive while they tap out on a key turn for, say, a Solitude or something along those lines, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. So, it can be important to be able to force through those last few points of damage. Primarily good when there's a huge number of blue decks in the format. Another variant you will occasionally see is the Green Splash. Now, this used to be the norm when Wild Nacatl was a thing. You'd see Burn have a 3-color mana base. This is before they had access to Canopy lands. They played like multiple Stomping Grounds, multiple Sacred Foundries. They'd even play Copperline Gorge as their fast land. Not as something you'll see as much. Primarily if you see the Green Splash anymore, it's now for Destructive Revelry, which is a kind of the more powerful, flexible version of Wear Tear and Smash to Smithereens kind of combined into one. Another card you will occasionally see, and something I toyed with in the Burn deck, was Clothis. Now, this card, it was more of a meme than anything, but it was a card that was good against the grinding matchups. You know, it could be very difficult for them to remove. Not so much anymore with Fairy Time, Rattler, and Prismatic Endings being everywhere, but I digress. Another card you occasionally see is Tunneling Angus, and this is whenever a land enters the battlefield, if they've had played them more than one land this turn, deals them 3 damage. This is specifically for Amulet Titan, which can be a very difficult matchup for Burn. Just the way the Burn deck can play out. And the other cards, Core Firewalker. This is the go-to for Burn mirrors or red-based mirrors, particularly Boros Burn or Obosh Red. This is a card that makes it very difficult for the opponent's attack or block, gains you a bunch of life throughout the matchup. This is a much narrower card as opposed to Sanctifier and Deck, but it is also much more powerful in the matchups which you expect to play if you expect to play a bunch of red in your meta. Rest in Peace is the primary graveyard hate card you'll see out of Burn. This is primarily for Dredge. You can see it against Living End as well, but both Blue Living End and Jund Living End, when it was more of a thing, tend to historically be reasonable matchups for Burn. So it gives you a little bit of extra insurance. Dredge, since the printing of Crippling Chill, has been an abysmal matchup for Burn. So hence, if you're expecting Dredge, you'll usually see Rest in Pieces, sometimes Tormod's Crypt, sometimes Relics of Progenitus. But those are the primary sideboard cards you'll see. I wanted to take a look at one more version of Burn here, and that is the version with Ensnaring Bridge. Now this card, some people are in love with it. I've had some mixed results with it over the years. It's good against like Tarmogoyf and Death Shadows and Murktides, but generally those decks all have some amount of tools to kind of deal with it, whether it be Kolaghan's Commands, Brazen Borrowers, counter spells. You know, obviously it's kind of like Deflecting Palm. It's very selectively important, and sometimes Burn can't quite empty its hand all the time. So it's kind of an awkward card at 3 mana for a deck that's trying to operate on 2 and 3 lands like Burn is most of the time. It's a card that is reasonable in some spots, but I've never been overly impressed by it. But it is another sideboard card that you can see out of Burn. And is there any other cards that I can think of? Grim Lavamancer used to be one when creature decks were more of a thing, which is a 1-mana 1/1 that taps. Remove 2 cards from your library, deal 2 damage to any creature. Pretty good against creature decks. Searing Blood is a additional searing effect you'll see sometimes. Doesn't have a landfall trigger, but only deals 2 damage to the creature, and if the creature dies, then you take 3. Its controller takes 3 damage. Prismatic Ending is a card that saw some brief play in Burn when the meta was more about 1s and 2s. That's pretty much most of the cards you'll see out of Burn sideboards. I think that's a pretty exhaustive list. And I already talked about some of the other cards you've seen out of Burn historically. You've seen some cards like Chandra's Incinerator when it was first printed was a thing, but it's just gotten worse and worse over time, and it was never the most consistent version. Another card you will see is Seal of Fire, which was an enchantment that you could play with Luris. Also, it was a card that allows you to play another deal with creature on turn 1 thing. One of the things Burn is a little bit weak against is a turn 1 creature when they're on the draw, because it's only a removal spell with Lightning Bolt. So occasionally in Burn or Prowess Mirrors or against Mana Dork decks, you wanted, like, say, a couple other options to deal with a quick creature. That was a card that would see some amount of play. And then pretty much everything else that you'll see play in like Pioneer and stuff is just a worse version of what you'll see in modern Burn. So, you know, all the special shock effects and stuff, you're generally not going to see that. Another card that sees play in Modern but does not see play in Burn is Bone Crusher Giant. It does give you a little bit of utility of having a Stomp plus a body, but is not efficient enough for what Burn is trying to do. As far as Burn's position in the meta, most people concentrate on the Burn spells and fail to realize that most of when Burn is good is when their creatures are good. One of the things is Burn is a 2 different pronged attack. You get to attack your opponent with spells, and you get to attack your opponent with creatures. Overall, very powerful. However, if your creatures can't reliably get in damage, then you become a spell-based deck, which you're much slower to kill opponents, oftentimes turn 4, turn 5. So, as Burn's affected creature effectiveness has gone down, the overall effectiveness of Burn as a deck has decreased. So, as Solitudes have been printed, as Fatal Pushes have been printed, as Unholy Heats have been printed, etc., and more efficient creature removal has been printed, the reliability of your Goblin guy getting in for 4 damage, or your Eidolon, getting in for 4 to 6 damage. They're still good, and they still have spots where they are excellent, but overall, I think the slight decline of Burn in the meta has been largely due to the ineffectiveness of their creatures, and really not getting any over-the-top spells. If you think of a format like Legacy, where Burn is very rarely played, however, it has access to much more powerful spells in the form of Price of Progress and Fire Blast, which are both spells that allow you to do an inordinate amount of damage out of nowhere. Price of Progress against modern mana bases would be absolutely huge. Those 4-color mana bases out of 4-color Omnath, you'd be dealing them 8 to 12 damage for 1 card. That would certainly help Burn catch up with where the format has gone. However, Burn's still a solid deck. If people aren't packing a bunch of life gain and such, it's still a deck that can perform reasonably well. And it's a deck, if you run hot, you can still do particularly well in a tournament. That's it. How to beat Burn. Primarily life gain plus backed by pressure, or life gain backed by some type of card advantage. So, Blue-White X control, some type of life gain with some early interaction. Can beat Burn. Your Murktide decks. Murktide generally is a reasonable matchup for Burn, but a quick Murktide backed up by some counter spells. Burn has some tough time with that. Historically, Jund and such would beat Burn by playing a quick Tarmogoyf for a quick Death Shadow backed up by some pressure. Generally, you want to pressure Burn while also managing Burn's resources. So whether that means, making them lose cards out of their hand, whether that means gaining life, however life gain mean you choose to do. Generally, the more efficient, the better it is. But it can't just be life gain alone. It has to be life gain backed by something else. Unless it's Soul Sisters, but Soul Sisters is a whole nother deck. But that's the primary way to beat Burn. You beat Burn with a little bit of life gain, a little bit of interaction, and a little bit of pressure, one way or another. If you look at the top decks of the format, 4-color Omnath, Burn has a reasonable matchup against it. However, if an opponent gets an Omnath down, starts gaining some life, kind of game over. And they do have enough early interaction. Is it Murktide? Burn has a reasonable matchup against them as well, but they do have a lot of early efficient interaction. Spell Pierce, Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt. All these cards to 1-for-1 your stuff early in the game. Then you get to this point where their card advantage and stuff starts to take over. A quick Murktide, etc. Or I'm trying to think what other decks are in the format that really pressure. Rhinos, Team of Rhinos. Quick 8 to 10 power on turn 3, disrupting, say, stomping their creature on 2, force of negating their Boros Charm. These little things, just ways that you can tempo Burn out and really prevent Burn from really getting a foothold in the game. That said, there are some matchups that have been historically pretty good for Burn. Matchups like Tron or Storm, or these matchups where what Burn does matches up particularly well against them. Tron, they might have a big payoff on turn 3, but most of their payoffs Burn doesn't care about. They don't care about Karn Liberated. They kind of care about Karn the Great Creator, depending on what they go and get. Whether it be a Chalice, a Trinisphere. But Wormcoil Engine has historically been the main thing there. So, a little bit of life gain, a little bit of pressure tends to go a long way towards beating Burn. That said, Burn does have some turn 3 nut draws. Kind of hard to beat that. Most of that involves 1-drop creatures. So once again, Burn, a little bit higher variance. They lost a little bit when they lost Luris. And then, as far as Burn moving forward, where its place in the meta is, I think right now Burn is like a tier 2-ish deck. It's a deck that can pop up. It's a deck that can certainly win a tournament. However, it's not been performing consistently the best lately. That said, people sleep on it a little bit. It can rise up and win an event. It's kind of gotten into the same deck category as decks like, it might be a little bit better off than Dredge and Tron, but it's still one of those decks that can just show up and win a tournament, and you do have to respect and learn and understand how to play against it. However, that said, I don't think it's in the strongest position that it's been in, largely because, as I mentioned, the creatures have gotten significantly worse. Solitude, Prismatic Ending, Fatal Push, Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt, Path to Exile. They're prismatic. There's just all these efficient removals to deal with Burn's creatures, and counterspells are getting more and more efficient. Discard spells are being discard spells. Urza Saga tokens backed by a Shadow Spear. There's all kinds of different things that weren't there when Burn was at zenith. And a lot of the matchups Burn used to prey upon, Tron, Storm, some of the creature matchups that weren't humans, a lot of those decks have just kind of faded away. And as they become a lesser part of the meta, you get a lot more 50-50 matchups that revolve around tight play, top decking at the right time, etc. So, like I said, Burn's still a reasonable deck. I would just say it's not where it's the strongest it's been historically. That said, I think that's a pretty good primer on what Burn is. As far as tips and tricks with the deck, learn your sequencing. Generally, you want to lead on your creatures first, especially in the early game. Try to get as much damage with them as possible. Another thing is try to be as mana efficient with your turns as possible. And learning the sequencing of spells is important. Whether you're playing around counter spells and say you want to go end step a burn spell and then untap in like main phase with 2 spells, you're generally like wanting to lead with your worst spell against a counter spell to try to bait out a counter. Like say you have a Skull Crack and a Boros Charm in hand. You might lead with a Skull Crack, try to bait out your opponent's counter spell. That way you can untap and Boros Charm them, getting in more damage. So there's a lot of little nuances with Burn that you learn as you play the deck more and more. That said, it's a fairly easy deck to pick up, probably one of the easiest decks in the Modern format to pick up, and will give you a reasonable amount of success, especially in the FNM or a League level. Now, as far as bigger events, I wouldn't necessarily recommend taking Burn into one of those right now, but it's still a deck that can show up if you run hot. So, that said, let me know if you like this kind of video series, and this has been John for MTG Nexus. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel.